Three. We did it.
We got
Friday.
it.
You're home.
Friday, which is very weird. I'm
Yeah.
home and you're not. This is the opposite world.
Oh no, now my internet's getting choppy and I'm not home and if we have an internet choppy problem, it's me.
Uh-oh. It sounds good. It sounds good to me.
Okay.
You're good. You're good to me.
All right.
So, yeah, well, you're up in Flagstaff. I'm back in Las Vegas for a short time. Had to restock on stuff and pick up Cosmo,
Yeah.
and we're gonna head to the coast. So next week we'll be in California. But yeah, so a little overview of, I guess, a little bit of about the end of my trip, and then we'll get into some cramping talk tonight because that was kind of the major thing that happened in my racing. So when last we talked, I was getting ready for a gravel race, and we talked a few months ago about doing different stuff and doing different types
Yep.
of training and different types of racing. And so I decided to do this gravel race in Spokane or near Spokane that went up Mount Spokane. It was about 5,500 feet of climbing in 30 miles with about two-thirds of it was on gravel
Mhm.
or fire trails. It was awesome. It was so epic. It was probably one of the highlights of the trip. And I didn't plan on even doing it like a week before, but it was just so surreal, especially the last like 10 miles was just like fire road and kind of by myself, just climbing and climbing and climbing. And every now and then I'd pass somebody. I had no idea how I was doing. I had good power and I was passing people. A few people passed me. But anyway, so we get to the last 2 miles and it started hailing. And it was kind of like raining on and off, but then it started hailing. And I've never like really ridden much in the hail like that. And got to the very, very top, and it was like 30 miles an hour wind and
Mm.
hailing. And I instantly got really, really cold. You know how you get after you've raced and it's cold? Because it was probably 35 degrees at the top. It's like
Oh,
shivering,
that's cool.
uncontrollable. Yeah, uncontrollably shivering. Fortunately, there was a nice gentleman at the top, a couple people up the top, and they let me sit in the truck for. I sat there for about an hour and a half to
Mm.
try and warm up. I could never quite break it though,
Yeah.
and so eventually they drove me down to where the clothes were. It was about miles down where the clothes were and the wards and stuff like that. Anyway, like I ended up in fourth place and got $125 check.
Oh,
So now I'm a pro athlete.
there you
Yeah,
go.
that was
Yes.
the prize for fourth. Yeah. So I think I have to register somewhere as a pro athlete now.
There you go.
So job well done. I was really happy with myself too. I did like 240 watts for 2.5 hours,
That's great.
and yeah, I was really really happy with that. In some ways, it was like kind of like a rediscovery of myself,
Yeah.
and it was nice too. Like I didn't worry about running afterwards, or just I could just concentrate on riding.
Hmm.
Um, then the next weekend was 70.3 Coeur d'Alene,
Yeah.
and I was really excited about it because I was swimming really well. Obviously, my biking I felt like it was pretty strong, and my running still is a work in progress. But so for those of you that don't know, the swim got cut short. So we woke up and well, we knew it was supposed to be windy on the day, but it wasn't supposed to be windy till like maybe 10 or 11.
Hmm.
But when we got up at 4 in the morning, you could hear this just blowing. And I said to Randall, who was staying with him, said they're gonna have a short and swim,
Mm.
or they're gonna cancel the swim. It's a big lake, you've been there.
Yeah.
It's a big lake. The wind was just going, especially the exact wrong direction. It
Hmm.
was kind of coming right to where we were going to swim out. So sure enough, we got to the transition area at like 5 in the morning, 5:15. They announced they were going to shorten it. And it was going to be a 500-meter swim. And I was like, oh man, this is for me. This is never happens. Like, never happens. I don't think I've ever had a 70.3 where the swim was canceled, and definitely not when it was shortened. And that's my weak point is the swim. So I'm like, okay, here we go. Like, I got a good shot here. I'm riding really well. Swimming is going good. 500, P500, John. Like, there were people being rescued at the 100-meter buoy.
Mm.
Because you know what the way a big lake is when it gets really windy, it's
Yeah.
kind of coming in from every direction. there's a few times where I like looked up and I got the face full of water. But yeah, my swim was only 8 minutes. It was it was pretty quick. So I got out and I started riding, and I was riding really, I felt really well. I figured I did 200 watts the week before. I do 220 and run off of that. But it was kind of crazy. Like at mile 30, I got a cramp in my thigh, and unbeknownst to me, it was the same kind of cramp that I had a couple of years ago at the Ironman World Championship, and it locked me up. I unfortunately at that point I was I think fourth in my age group when I look back at the tracker. Get off my bike and stretch, and I just couldn't put any power down. So I ended up at like 190 watts for the effort, and unfortunately, kind of gave up a lot of spots. And but anyways, had a good run. Did a 140 half marathon, which I was really, and yeah. So that was the day. And so anyways, that leads us to the discussion cramping. And John's back. So I'll keep telling my story about the
Yeah.
so it was really interesting too, because like after I cramped on the bike, I had about 20 more miles to go. Fortunately, it was with a tailwind, and so I didn't have to put in a lot of watts. But then even like after mile one on the run, everything was gone. And so this is very much it seems like it was very much a bike related issue. But that being said, I've struggled with cramping for a long time, and at different points in my triathlon journey. And I've done a lot of things to help mitigate it. And even this week, I've spent a lot of time deeper and deeper. And I've got friends that do cramping research, and I've talked to them. I teach about cramping in my classes, but I'm just someone that suffers from this. So I took a relatively deep dive into the mechanisms of cramping this week, and because I'm trying to ultimately solve this problem. And for those of you that suffer from this, you're not alone. And some people are just genetically predisposed to it. And when it really gets down to it, if you're genetically predisposed, there's evidence also to support the more times you cramp, the more you're gonna cramp. And there's really limited things that we can do to avoid it. So today I thought we could go through some of the things that that I've tried in the past, and some of the science behind ways to treat cramping, ways to prevent it, and ultimately maybe debunk some of the common misconceptions around cramping. So I guess I don't know if John's coming back, but I think
I love this, and I'm listening.
okay.
I'm moving to a better spot, but
Okay.
there's a great introduction, and I'll keep my video off until I
Okay.
but I love the story about getting into this topic again. I know we did it before, but cramping is one of these things that happens that's hard to explain. So maybe start from the beginning. If you're lecturing in class,
Yeah.
how do you define what a cramp is?
Yeah, that's perfect. So in cramping in sports, I mean, it kind of has a special name. So exercise-induced muscle cramping. And because there's different types of cramping, like people have had like night cramps, maybe they're laying in bed and they just get a cramp. There's other diseases that cause cramping, but this is specifically related to exercise. And what it is it's basically, the easiest thing about it is you've got nerves in your body that send messages to the muscles, and some send muscle messages to relax, some send muscle messages to contract. And basically what ends up happening is the messenger to relax basically gets kind of overwhelmed by the messenger to contract. And that's what causes ultimately the muscle basically to get hard and completely hold on. And once again, I know people in the endurance world and in sports that never have had one. And it's fun. It's kind of interesting. Like I can remember when I first started working as an athletic trainer, I would have a couple of athletes that, and I can specifically remember football athletes, they would cramp and they were like the highest level athletes. And everyone had their opinion. Oh, you need to do this, and you need to do this, and you need to do this. And this is 30 years ago. And it's interesting that the research continues to move, although relatively slowly. So once again, we don't really know what causes this imbalance, and there's lots of theories behind it. And if you were to once again quickly like Google what causes muscle cramps, the first thing that always pops up is electrolyte imbalances.
Mm-hmm. Let me jump in real quick because I like how you define cramping, exercise induced, and that's an important part because cramping could happen without exercise, and sometimes we're just sitting. Well, at the last, where was it? St. George. I think we were all just sitting around, and all of a sudden my leg just cramped up, but
Yep,
that could be exercise associated.
because it was after the race.
Yeah, yeah.
That's still exercise associated.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But there are people that honestly can just cramp out of nowhere.
That's right. You can get cramping, that doesn't necessarily have to happen. That's associated with exercise. And so there's all different forms of cramping. And the part of the research that's really confusing is trying to induce a cramp versus studying cramps that happen naturally. And a lot of the induced cramp research is with a small muscle, like something at the thumb, because the thumb can be very isolated, and that muscle moving the thumb can be isolated, and you can fatigue that muscle and then cause it to cramp. Or you can do a self-inducing cramp, which is not easy. But all the different types of cramps makes it really difficult to actually study. So that's what I was going to ask you as my next question, though. Let's get into theories of cramping. And like you said, what's word on the street that causes it?
And I love the fact you mentioned about like the research, right? Because it's almost always has to be retrospective in sports, right? Because once again, we can induce it with electrical stimulation. And our guest that was on, Lauren Dickey, she's doing her dissertation on this, and we're doing it actually on a small muscle in the foot to cause like your big toe to cramp.
Yep.
And we can absolutely do this. We can make any muscle basically cramp given the right frequency and the right duration of electric current. We can absolutely do that. But once again, we almost always choose these small ones. And it's never exercise that's doing it, right? We're electrically doing it. And so that is, oftentimes it's like research done off of surveys. So off of, for example, like tennis players, they did a big research, on professional tennis players, and looking at, all these different factors and why this person cramps versus this person cramping. But it's retrospective. It's not like you can take a big group of athletes and once again, these people we're gonna do an intervention to make these people cramp.
Right.
Really, really difficult to do.
No, it is difficult, but some interesting work that I've seen, and this has actually even been done with some Ironman races, is they've recruited a bunch of people and then they classified them as crampers or non-crampers.
Yep.
That sun coming from, it's hitting my computer. And then they looked at markers of blood, and I'm sure you're familiar with that type of study. So so word on the street, what's causing the cramp?
Electrolyte imbalances.
Yeah, right.
But when they take these people's blood, what does it show, John?
Yeah, that's not the reason.
If anything, when they take their blood, they have more blood sodium. And we talked about this a little bit before on our last podcast, but basically when you sweat out a higher concentration of water than you do sodium or salt. And so like when you take these sweat patches, that you measure the amount you sweat and like, of sodium, I got to replace this amount of sodium. That doesn't take into account the amount of water. Right? And like once again, when we took when the research looked at this and they took the crampers and they took the non-crampers and they did blood tests on them, when they cramped, they had higher levels of blood sodium than they did pre exercise.
Right.
And it's kind of like you dehydrate yourself of water quicker than you dehydrate yourself of salt. That's the
Mhm.
easiest way to think about it. So the theory is, oh, but you need more salt to mitigate the cramping.
Right.
And here's the thing that in my deep dive this week and looking at this is I kept coming up to this term electrolyte imbalances.
Mhm.
So well, really quickly, John, what's an electrolyte?
Yeah, it's a substance in your body that helps make electrical things happen.
Yeah, moves electrons basically around, right? And so we love this term in sports.
Mhm.
Um, there's this movie, I don't know if you've ever seen it, called Idiocracy.
Uh,
Basically,
I haven't seen that. No.
it's a funny movie. It's probably 10 or 15 years old. But basically, we get to the point in our evolution where everyone's pretty dumb.
Yeah, yeah.
Just everyone's pretty dumb. And they kill all their plants by feeding the plants electrolyte, like basically sports drinks,
Okay.
right? Because everyone, you got to have electrolytes.
Yeah, yeah.
And no one really even knew what an electrolyte was at a certain point. And we love to use this term in sports. Oh, you got to have your electrolyte drink,
Mhm.
right? You got to have electrolytes. So the primary electrolyte that we think about is sodium, but we have potassium, we have magnesium, we have calcium, we have chloride, we have blood. Just keep moving on and on and on. But we think of sodium as the most important because we need all of those things to have muscle contractions,
Mhm.
right? And we also know in the research that too high or too low of those things can be a problem for people in general, but it has to get really bad on either side to be too high or too low.
Yeah, and the sodium is really part of muscle contraction, as you said, because there's this sodium potassium pump that helps moves things in and out of a muscle cell. And if that sodium potassium pump doesn't operate well, the muscle's not going to contract very well. So it all makes sense, but there's some good research out there that's refuted it. But
Yep.
I also have seen the research that refutes it, but then they still put an asterisk next to that and say, who knows?
Yeah, but
Yeah, you can't say that electrolytes aren't part of the cramping process. Maybe it's a different type of cramp or something else is going on or some mitigating factor or something else that's getting complex.
because I've seen people that are we call it hyponatremic.
Yeah.
So basically means they actually have significantly depleted blood sodium
Hmm.
to the point where they can be hospitalized.
Yeah.
And cramping is not very closely related to hyponatremia.
Hmm. Hmm.
So if lack of sodium really was the issue, those people that are hyponatremic, you'd think that they would cramp,
Right.
but it's not really. Yes, could they coincidentally cramp? Yeah, but not more than a person that wasn't hyponatremic. So then
So
go ahead.
I was just going to say, so the recommendations are still stay hydrated, still take your electrolytes, but not necessarily for cramping issues,
Right.
but may have a role, but not, it doesn't seem to be that clear. So what's the next big theory?
So the next big theory is basically a neuromuscular fatigue theory.
Hmm.
And this is where most of the research is going now.
Hmm.
And once again, having electrolyte drink or taking electrolytes in, it will basically do you no harm during your race.
Right.
It's not going to solve your cramping issues.
Hmm.
I can tell you that right now because, and I'll just give you once again a personal experience. I have cramped once again in T1 so many times, it's
Hmm.
ridiculous. Like if I, and that's actually part of the reason I was so excited about this race. I knew I was going to cramp in T1 because it was only an 8-minute swim.
Hmm. Hmm.
And but it doesn't make sense to cramp and like is it that I'm so depleted after a 35-minute swim that I cramp doesn't make any sense,
Hmm.
right? There's not enough time, and I'm definitely not losing enough sodium
Right.
while I'm swimming 35 minutes
Right.
to cause a cramp.
No, and
So
I
go
think
ahead.
makes this all confusing is because maybe electrolytes help cramping for one, we're talking, cramping is one word, but there's all different ways to get to that cramp. And so I like this neuromuscular part as well. And I know you've have dove into this a bit more. So talk a little bit about that.
So basically, it is a miscommunication somehow between the nerves and the muscles,
Hmm.
or a hypersensitivity of the nerve stimulating the muscle. And one thing, this is where most of the research is going. And when we really think about it, it's the muscle is not prepared well enough, is one of the way to look at to the stresses that are going to be put upon it.
Mhm.
So it's basically, if you think about it, it's kind of like the body somehow overstimulating the muscle via the neurologic system. So once again, in our neurologic system, I already talked about this, we have nerves that are responsible for relaxation of muscle and nerves that are responsible for excitation of muscle. And
Mhm.
when we contract a muscle, like on our own, like we're running or we're cycling, and we contract the muscle, the signal goes to the muscle and says, "Hey, contract." But there's also one that goes, "Hey, relax." And so it's an imbalance between those two things.
Yep.
And once again, we're still trying to figure out why that happens.
Yep.
And there's lots of theories behind it. The biggest one that you see is that the muscle itself has not basically been, or the muscle and the nerve system together have not been trained to deal with what you're putting it up to.
Mhm.
And so the best example is thinking about like an athlete doing their sport, like me, for example, and not training to the level that I'm going to race at, or I'm doing something different in the racing than I've been training for. Because I can almost never get a cramp training. Sometimes swimming, I can,
Mhm.
but only when I'm swimming after I've like done something else, usually that day. So like I had a run earlier in the day or I had a bike earlier in the day, then I'm more likely to cramp swimming. So basically, we're looking at this as maybe it's almost an exhaustion of the neural input to allow relaxation versus contraction. And that can be, once again, me, and I'll just give you my thought process. This will kind of help me think of this in this race or other races, is I never would swim 38 minutes as hard as I could, or 37 minutes, or 36 minutes as hard as I could. I would do, 20 times 100 with a little break, and not just that, at every turn on the pool, a break, right? Like every time I flip turn, little break, flip
Mhm.
turn, little break. So the kind of going along this theory is to kind of train this out. I should be open water swimming in a wetsuit at race intensity or closer to race intensity more,
Mhm.
because my something is telling my body that during race that, hey, like we're basically overstimulating the system and you're not ready for that overstimulation.
Mhm.
And that overstimulation can be added up over time, because we also find that the more basically muscle fatigue you have, or fatigue, not even muscle fatigue, just fatigue in the system you have, the more likely you are to cramp. So why did I cramp on the bike at mile 35 or
Mhm.
mile 30? My theory is this: I did a gravel race the weekend before, and I went all in, and it was, like, and that, once again, I've never done a race like that, so I taxed my system there. I didn't cramp in that situation, and then throughout the week, I did a few more rides, um, because I felt like I hadn't been on the time trial bike enough. To be honest with you, I'm like, I need to be on the time trial bike more. Um, and I never fully recovered, I think, from the gravel race. And I was more, neurologically taxed. And honestly, I have not been riding the time trial bike enough.
Mhm. And
And
gravel bike was all uphill.
it was all uphill. So I'm in a different position. Now I'm in a flat position in the time trial bike. And honestly, like looking back at the times that I've cramped on the time trial, I've only ever cramped on the time trial bike. I think that my training has not been close enough to the race scenario,
Mhm.
where once again I'm pushing 220 watts. At this point, it was 2 hours and 15 minutes
Okay.
ish. My cramp. I just don't do that on the weekend before. I did it on a road bike going uphill or a gravel bike going uphill,
Yeah.
but I think it was just too much change. And
Mhm.
so if I was to think about how I fix this, it's doing more efforts at race pace on the time trial bike.
Mhm.
That would be, if I was coaching myself, that would be the prescription I'd give myself.
Yeah.
And probably don't do a gravel bike ride all out a week before.
Yeah, that's probably not the right way to prep for a race, but still,
But I don't regret it, because honestly, like out of
that's
my whole trip, that was the highlight.
that's right.
So life is for living,
Yeah. Well,
and
this
yeah,
and I like the overview of this neuromuscular and the explanation. And people, a lot of people have eStim units now that you buy them off Amazon, and you know that you can make your muscle just get this static contraction, a cramp, just by turning up that frequency of that stimulation. And that's in essence what's being talked about in this neuromuscular model is the signal going to the muscle, or some type of reflex that's happening is what's interfering with the way the muscle should be contracting. And now it's getting into an isometric, it's just contracting without control.
yeah. And so I don't know. I think we can get even deeper in this, because this is in my deep dive. Actually, I came across this last year. There is a protocol that is being bandied about that says what you should do is use some of one of these e-stimulants, not the ones you can get on Amazon. Well, yes, you probably get them on Amazon, but a very specific frequency to actually cause a muscle cramp the day before.
Mm,
And you almost have a refractory period where you won't cramp again the next day.
yeah.
But man, that's a big gamble.
Mhm.
Like, I can't even imagine like sitting there the day before 70.3 and putting because I kind of know the muscles that
Mhm.
cramp for me, and putting a stim unit on and actually causing a cramp. But I might consider it as a little test, right? So that's an interesting thing. The other thing is that we have some things out there that can help alleviate cramps or even help prevent them, especially when you notice them starting to happen. So I will tell you this, like I now am very sensitive to it, and I know when it's going to happen. Like when I was on the bike, I was pushing pretty good watts once again, and I was riding with two guys, and I can remember I went to the front of this little group of three, legally, and I went to the front and I pushed really hard, and I was like, "Ooh, don't do that." Like
Mhm.
I just felt something, you know what I mean? Oh man, that's a little bit too heavy. And it wasn't too heavy for my cardiovascular system or even like my muscular system of my legs. Like it was within what I could do, but I could feel like a little cramp coming on. So there are things we can do to mitigate it if you're prepared. And I unfortunately wasn't prepared.
Mm. All right. So which mitigation, which ways do you want to talk about? Do you want nutrition or
Well, number one is to just lower your power,
yeah.
right? Number two would be to change your position.
Mm-hmm.
So in retrospect, I should have got off the bike and lowered my saddle,
Mm-hmm.
because I have a little wrench. I could lowering my saddle probably would have been a really smart thing to do, because now you're changing the muscle recruitment pattern,
Right,
right?
right.
So there are positional changes. There's things you can do as far as like when you're on the bike or running, you could change your form a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but
Well, and it's interesting you mentioned that because one of the papers I read, the one of the predictors of who cramped was running speed.
oh yeah,
Faster runners were more likely to get cramps. And
yep, yep.
that race intensity or above even, I mean, that is a causative factor related to cramps.
So it's funny we were talking about this, because one thing, I think it's a positional thing a lot as well. So I didn't used to ever have this happen, and I think like if I really think back to when it kind of started is when I bought a road bike.
Hmm.
So I used to do. I only owned a time trial bike for years.
Yeah. Hmm.
Every ride was done on it,
Hmm.
and then I got a road bike. And I'm like, oh, this is fun. This is nice. Like I really like the road bike, and I think that I just need to be on that time trial bike more.
Hmm.
But anyways, you asked about nutrition.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not going to speak to like nutrition like during the week or anything like that, because once again, you read about, oh, you make sure you got lots of sodium. Well, I have a ton of sodium. Like I eat a lot of sodium, especially the week of a race. I just do. So there are a few things that are out there that are marketed. So the main one you've probably heard of and everyone's heard of is pickle juice. There's a company called the Pickle Juice Company that you can buy little shots of pickle juice. They absolutely work. And there's another company called Hot Shot. We've talked about them before. They absolutely work. I had 3 of them waiting in T2 for me because I always bring 3 on a run for a 70.3. But I didn't bring one on the bike, and I normally do. But because I had a short swim, I was like, oh, I'm not going to need one. Like, because I always associated it with the swimming, not necessarily the biking. Now, in the full Ironman, I always would have them on the bike. So these are really interesting things. So at first, we thought that pickle juice worked by basically giving you more sodium, because there's a lot of sodium in pickle juice. But it actually works in 45 seconds to a minute. And that is way quicker than we can actually absorb the sodium.
Mm-hmm.
So there's these receptors in your esophagus. They're called TRP channels. And transient receptor, I can't remember what it stands for, but it doesn't matter. But basically, they stimulate your vagus nerve. When they're stimulated, they stimulate your vagus nerve. And really, your vagus nerve, kind of one of the main nerves of your body, it's one of the cranial nerves, its job is to slow things down.
Mm-hmm.
Slows down your heart, but also slows down the signaling basically to your muscles, and that actually helps you relax. And so pickle juice and hot shot will stimulate that because of, and it's a weird thing, it's literally has to do with the taste.
Yeah.
So historically, people have used other things. John, what have you heard of other people using?
Fruit quinine, is that?
Yeah.
And I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. Theophylline.
Theophylline, which I think is in mustard.
It's what?
So people use, like, I think that's the active ingredient that is in mustard. So people use mustard packets.
Yeah.
And you may have heard of that.
I read a paper where the combination of those two things may help improve cramps once you had cramps.
Yeah. And those are active ingredients basically in hot shot.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So people have used, once again, they've used like mustard packs, hot sauce is another one. Yeah. If you've taken a hot shot, it kind of tastes like a mix of mustard, cinnamon.
It is a hot shot. Yeah, that's right.
It's I honestly, but it works. And so as soon as I hit T2, I had one, and then I had 2 more for the run, but I never cramped on the run.
Yeah.
And I was, every couple of miles having a little sip of the hot shot. And even with 1 mile to go, actually my best splits were my last 2 miles. And I think I just let myself relax. And I'm like, okay, you're not going to cramp. You can run hard here.
So hot shot tube, or do you put it in a pocket, or?
I have it in a pocket. Yeah. I have like 3 little bottles in a pocket, and I really wish I would have had it on the bike.
Yeah.
But anyway, so those do work, but it's more of it's more of like once it's starting to happen. You can't necessarily, like, I wouldn't have taken it, like, say when I got on the bike, if I wouldn't feel like it's going to happen.
Right.
But if on that first little twinge, if I had on the bike, I would have taken it. I think it would have mitigated it. But that being said, it doesn't change the fact that I think that I need to do specific training to stress my system in a progressive overload way towards race pace.
Yeah.
And
that's I was going to start saying, okay, now how do you avoid it? How do you prepare for it? And you've talked a little bit about it, but go ahead, go more into that.
And the worst part is, John, is that I absolutely 100% coach this, but I don't always do it myself. And I hate to admit that, like, I'm my own worst enemy with this kind of thing. And part of it is because, and this time, because I have a new bike. My road/gravel bike is just awesome. And I was on this epic journey of 3 weeks, and I was riding these unbelievable climbs all over the place. And I only got like 3 rides in on my time trial bike. And all 3 of them, I was constant, basically trying to go low power because I've been doing so much climbing at high power. So my next training block is going to be less on the road bike. And when I'm on the road bike, that'll be the easy rides, and my harder efforts on the time trial bike. And we're going to see if that fixes it. The other thing I really wanted to talk about tonight, though, is the genetic side. Okay. So in my reading, and there was always a little asterisk at the bottom of everything. Well, there's probably some genetic reasoning behind. And it's so easy to blame genetics, right? Well, this person cramps, this person doesn't cramp. It's got to be genetics. So, man, I took a deep dive today into genetics. And fortunately, I've actually done a full genetic analysis on myself. And so then I used an AI program and uploaded my genetics into the AI and said, okay, what are the most common genetic polymorphisms that would make someone susceptible to exercise-induced muscle cramping? And sure enough, it spits out, these are like the 7 most likely, and here's the reasons why. And I'm like, okay, well, what are the reasons why? And then I said, okay, now these are my genetic polymorphisms. Which ones would most likely make me a cramper? And it absolutely popped up some. And it's super, super interesting stuff. Because once again, like I ran it on me, and I had some of these polymorphisms pop up that would say that, you know, yes, Ted, you are more susceptible to be a cramper. And so I came up with, there was actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 genetic polymorphisms. Some are in the same gene, but there's a different polymorphism within that gene. So we have the ACE, you probably heard of the angiotensin converting enzyme gene. But anyways, I came up with 5 of them. And then I also went into, okay, well, what are the practical applications or practical suggestions based off of my genetic polymorphisms? Okay, so this was a deep dive, John. This took many, many hours to come up with. And at the very end of all of this, I came up with a few things that might actually be to help my genetic polymorphisms, because all of them come up and say, number 1, ensure proper hydration. Well, I'm already trying to do that. Number 2, maintain electrolyte balance. Really hard to know, right? Like, what is balance while you're exercising? Once again, we have all of these electrolytes happening. So, but all of them had that. Next one was like monitor adaptation strategies. So, like, you know, we just talked about like how am I adapting to the performances that I want to do? And the next one that was kind of new that I didn't come up with, and this one actually had to do with it's called the CPT2 gene. It's basically involved in metabolism of fatty acids in muscles. And it said basically, you know, look at making sure that I'm getting enough medium chain fatty acids, which I don't really look at too closely, and then a carnitine supplement, which I've never used. So it did come up with a few things that were kind of like out of the like the general playbook of, hey, you know, maintain your electrolytes, maintain your hydration, gradually acclimatize to exercise. So I've got a few little things that a few little levers. But this is, I mean, to me, this is kind of like the future of like looking at some of these genetic things. And instead of, once again, just being like, oh, you know, that's your genetics that are causing that. It's like, well, let's go deeper into the specific polymorphisms. And once again, I know this is getting really deep and not everyone's run their genetics. Once again, I did it like 7, 8 years ago. The cool thing when you run your genes, and I know you did too, because we did them with Jessica.
I love this because, you know, one of the leading risk factor for cramping is previous cramping.
Yeah.
Family history of cramping is a risk factor for cramping. And so I love that you've gone down this path of looking at the genetic angle, not only from, you know, big picture, but then also specific to yourself and coming up with actionable items. And that is that's impressive. And because you have the history of cramping, therefore there must be something about that history. And I like that you're going down this path trying to figure out, is there something in the genes?
Well, and that's the thing, right? It's like we know that there's a genetic component.
Yeah.
Like, because John, I've been around hundreds of thousands of athletes in my career. And we could have 2 athletes on the same team that do the exact same thing, basically eat the same thing, do everything the same, and this person cramps, this person doesn't cramp. Well, why?
Yep.
Right? And it's not, oh, they need to drink more Gatorade because this person's drinking just the same amount as this person. There is something genetic. Now, the tricky thing with the genetic stuff, and I know you know this, and you've done a lot of reading in this, is I can't change my genes, right? But when you know and you have a little bit of knowledge that there are certain things that you could do potentially either through training or through diet
Yep.
that might make that gene less expressed or
Hmm.
more
Hmm.
expressed.
Yeah.
And once again, this is getting deep. And but if we ever want to kind of get to the bottom of these things that are, that have a genetic component, I think this is the next
Yeah.
step.
That's right. That's right.
And
This is
with
one factor.
yeah,
Uh, a risk factor is history of cramping.
yeah.
No, that,
So you didn't know we were going to go down that road because we didn't talk about that before, but
yeah.
this was a 3 hour deep dive today,
Mhm.
and arguments with ChatGPT and here's the thing is like you have to be, and we've talked a little bit of this before, and using like AI, like not only did I run it and run it over and over again and run different ways, and used the AI to help me, but there were times when the AI was giving me the wrong stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
And
Hallucinate.
it was hallucinating, and it was like, well, you have this polymorphism, and I'm like, I went back to look at my raw data. I'm like, no, I don't. Like,
Hmm.
where are you getting this? You're analyzing my data and you're giving me the wrong polymorphism.
Hmm.
And I'm like, can you reevaluate the data and look specifically? Oh yeah, my apologies. Remember, because these hallucinations do occur. And so, and I know you like to use these talks for a class, and maybe this will be one you do, but it's really, really important that right now, especially with AI, that we go back and we check
Yeah.
and we double check,
Hmm.
especially if we're going to be like, let's say I had a client that wanted me to do this for them.
Hmm.
It's one thing with me, like if I make a mistake, yeah, it's no big deal. But if I give somebody specific information that's coming from an artificial intelligence source, you need to kind of cross check and reference and cross back to this. So just once again, throwing that out.
No, I love it. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, and just want to make a couple other risk factors.
Yep.
Older age
Yep.
is a risk factor, higher body mass index, and I also came across irregular stretching habits.
It's a really interesting one, right? So when we look at the research on stretching
Mhm.
and cramping, you could do a little Google on this one. It's kind of fun. Does if I stretch too much, can it cause cramping?
Right, right,
And the answer is yes.
yeah.
If I don't stretch, does it cause cramping? And the answer is yes.
Mm.
Right. So how much is right? And
Good.
we do know that it's an interesting thing. Stretching causes an inhibitory signaling,
Mhm.
which, by the way, also when you do have a cramp, that's why stretching works to
Mm.
like alleviate it, because it actually stimulates an inhibitory mechanism.
Yeah,
It's relatively transient; it doesn't last very long. But if you get an active cramp, like when saying I got off of my bike and had to stretch. Now, unfortunately, the muscle that I needed to stretch was a very difficult one.
yeah.
It's called the sartorius. It's really, really hard
Mm.
to stretch, but um, it's part of it. Like it's actually interesting. One of the things in some when I delved deep into my genetics, that was actually one of the things that came up that wasn't in one of the polymorphisms that I had.
Interesting.
Um, that said, I probably need to do more stretching and more foam rolling and more massage. But because John, this was such a deep dive, because then I started looking like, well, what are the polymorphisms that I have for tendinopathies? Because I've had lots of tendon issues, and I came up with a bunch. And then same thing, like, what do I do about it? And one of them was like to do more stretching and more foam rolling. So
Great. Interesting. Well, along with what you said earlier in terms of what you can do about it, the other term I came up with in terms of how to avoid is functional movement training, which is what you're talking about with your bike and bike fit, being on the time trial bike more so or tri bike versus a road bike. Strength training.
swimming, like and swimming in the open water.
Yeah, yeah, right, right, right. Very functional, right. And
So
then
one of the reasons I went to Coeur d'Alene early, and I mean, obviously, I'm lucky I was able to do that. And I swam in the lake like 6 times in 2 weeks leading up.
yeah,
Purposely, because I've been dealing with this cramping in T1, and I'm like, I got to get open water swimming regularly. And fortunately, the place I was staying at, John, it was a quarter mile to the lake.
mm-hmm.
And I went to the lake every other day.
Yeah. Yeah.
with that purpose. And I was really kind of hoping to test that out. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad we didn't swim the 2K because it was miserable.
Right.
But and I think that I'm really kind of looking forward to like this next build that I'm going to do towards my next long race, and see if ultimately my theory is right. If I get on the time trial bike,
Mm-hmm.
spend more time in that, if I can open water swim more, to make it more specific. At least for me, once again, like, because I have this history, I think I need to go down this road. If I never cramped
Mm-hmm.
and never had any of these issues, maybe it's not as important for somebody else that doesn't have these things.
No, there's been something you've been battling all along, so it makes sense to really attack it.
Yeah.
And then the last how to avoid I came up with by looking at some different papers is acclimatization to climate, which makes sense, especially the hot, humid environments, getting acclimatized to that so that you can have as good of a race and not and minimize your risk of cramping that way.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Like, think about where I was racing in the day. It was 65 degrees.
Yeah, right.
Like, and I'd been living there for 2 weeks.
Yeah. Not
Like,
it.
it wasn't acclimatization, that's for sure. I think it's more the acclimatization to the training, to make the training a little bit closer to the racing. And I
Mhm.
know we're really into this polarization model right now, right?
Mhm.
Because that's all of the talk. But maybe for me and for crampers, we need to do more stuff right at race pace.
Yeah.
But
No.
I don't know. That's my theory.
Well, I love it. And one of the quotes I took from one of the papers I read, I should have written the author down. I can't attribute it to someone right now, but they wrote it's unlikely that a single mechanism can account for all cramps in all situations. Therefore, the search for a single causal mechanism is probably futile. So, but I mean, going down the genetic path, I mean that I think is brilliant, but at the same time, it's going to be different for everybody.
Exactly. And once again, you can't change your genes,
Right.
right? I can't go back and change who my parents were, nor would I want to. And well, if one wasn't maybe if I didn't have some of these polymorphisms, maybe, but no. But in all seriousness, you can't change that. But once again, like, a little knowledge goes a long way. And John, I could be completely wrong.
Yeah,
I could do all this stuff. I could try these changes, and it still happens.
but
And
it's a good example of looking at the science out there and then trying to apply the science to a very specific situation. And that's a good example. And it's still hit or miss, but that's you're doing the best thing you can at this point.
but I'm gonna have less fun because I really do like
Yeah.
I really do like the road bike rides. Um, but yeah, I just think I need to kind of flip things around a little bit and try something different. And because once again, it would be futile for me just to keep doing what I'm doing and just have this happen. And
And expect something different.
because literally the last two races, I think in some way or another have been ruined because of cramping. Like I'm bitter about it because it's kind of like in some ways not fair that I have this happen. Um, like I really like I was in a podium position when this happened, and my run was right in the middle of where it should have been to be on the podium.
Mm-hmm.
And to not get that podium spot
It's
when
frustrating.
like you have the bike fitness and like to do it. Like I said, 240 watts the week before, and I end up finishing with 190 watts, like same basically time on the bike.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like I feel cheated,
Yeah, yeah, right, right.
you know. But it's hard, and don't get me wrong, like, I was bitter like that night. I was pretty bitter about not about anything other than like I felt like unlucky, like that I this happened
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't expect that wattage to happen.
No.
So we'll figure it out.
Today.
It's part of it, and I think that things like this make me a better coach. Going through this myself because there's athletes that I work with that have cramping issues as well. So it is what it is.
It would not be as fun if everything always went perfect.
Exactly. Exactly. All right, John. Well, hey, enjoy your time in Flagstaff.
Yeah,
Stay cool.
yeah,
I'm sure a little cooler there. What's the temperature?
a little bit.
What was the high today up there?
Yeah, let's see, it's 77 right now, so
That's pretty dang good.
take that.
Okay, awesome.
Have a great
Be safe up
weekend.
there. Okay, you too. Bye.